On July 20th, 1944, at 12:42 in the afternoon, a bomb exploded beneath a wooden table in the Lair, Hitler's heavily guarded military headquarters in East Prussia. For one brief, electrifying moment, a small group of German army officers believed they had just assassinated their Führer and reclaimed the soul of their nation. They were wrong, and their failure would cost them everything. But before they died, before the Gestapo's torches, before the show trials and executions, these men had already accomplished something far more dangerous than any bomb. They had conspired against Hitler himself, and in doing so, they had proven that not all of Germany's generals were willing to march blindly into annihilation. Klaus Philipp Maria Schenk, Graf von Stauffenberg, was not the man you'd expect to become Hitler's would-be assassin. Born in 1907 into one of Germany's most aristocratic Swabian families, Stauffenberg had spent his youth as a true believer. He loved Germany with the burning intensity that only a young idealist can. When the Nazis rose to power, he did not immediately recoil. Like many officers, he told himself that Hitler represented restoration, order, and a return to German greatness. But something in Stauffenberg was different. He possessed a quality rare among military men. He could think beyond orders. He could see the architecture of events, not merely execute them. In 1939, as a young staff officer, Stauffenberg served in Poland during the invasion. What he witnessed there changed him forever. He saw the atrocities, the massacres, the systematic dehumanization that the Nazi regime inflicted upon Polish civilians and Jews. Most officers looked away. Stauffenberg could not. The systematic dehumanization that the Nazi regime inflicted upon Polish civilians and Jews. Most officers looked away. Stauffenberg could not. In 1943, Stauffenberg was severely wounded in North Africa while serving as a panzer officer. A British air attack destroyed his vehicle. Shrapnel tore through his body. He lost his left eye, his right hand, and 2 fingers on his left hand. When he recovered, he was assigned to the Army General Staff in Berlin. It was there, in the corridors of power, that he discovered he was not alone. There were other officers, men of conscience, men of intelligence, who had reached the same terrible conclusion. Hitler had to be removed, not for political reasons, not for military advantage, but because Hitler was leading Germany toward absolute destruction. And the only men with the power to stop him were bound by oath and by terror. The conspiracy that formed around Stauffenberg was not a sudden creation. It had roots going back years. There were generals who had whispered doubts. Ludwig Beck, the brilliant former chief of the General Staff, who had opposed Hitler's war plans before the invasion of Poland. Henning von Treschow, an operations officer on the Russian front who had already attempted to kill Hitler twice and failed. Fabian von Schlabrendorf, a lawyer and officer who had helped Treschow plant bombs in Hitler's aircraft. Karl Gordeler, the former mayor of Leipzig, who moved in intellectual circles and maintained contact with the Western Allies, and Admiral Wilhelm Canaris, the head of military intelligence, who had gradually transformed the Abwehr into a refuge for conspirators. These were not radical revolutionaries. They were Prussian officers, diplomats, lawyers, and theologians, men steeped in the traditions of German culture and military honor. What united them was not ideology. It was mathematics. By 1943, the war was mathematically lost. Germany's industrial capacity could not match the combined output of America, Britain, and the Soviet Union. The Eastern Front was bleeding the Wehrmacht white. The Luftwaffe had lost air superiority. The U-boat fleet was being systematically annihilated. Hitler's response to every setback was the same: more fanaticism, more terror, more sacrifice. He demanded total war, demanded that every resource, every life, be consumed in pursuit of a victory that was already impossible. When Stauffenberg arrived in Berlin in 1944, the conspiracy gained something it had lacked before: operational capability. He had access. He attended military briefings and had the trust of General Friedrich Fromm, the commander of the Reserve Army, a man who was sympathetic to the conspirators' cause, or at least willing to look the other way. Stauffenberg also possessed something else: absolute moral clarity. He knew what had to be done, and unlike many other conspirators who had wavered and rationalized, he was willing to act. By spring of 1944, the conspirators had moved beyond discussion into planning. They had British-made plastic explosives smuggled in through Abwehr contacts. They had a plan. Stauffenberg would carry the bomb into a military briefing where Hitler was present. The bomb would detonate, killing Hitler. With him dead, General Fromm and other sympathetic commanders would activate Operation Valkyrie, an existing contingency plan designed to mobilize the Reserve Army in case of civil unrest. But Valkyrie would be used for a different purpose: to arrest the SS, the Gestapo, and all of Hitler's loyalists. A new government would be formed. Peace negotiations would begin with the Western Allies, and Germany would be saved from total annihilation. It was an audacious plan, and desperate. The conspirators knew the odds of success were minimal. Security around Hitler was suffocating. The bomb might not work. Hitler might not be killed. Even if he was, the Nazi Party and the military were so intertwined that removing Hitler might not remove the regime. But doing nothing guaranteed catastrophe. Millions more would die. Germany would be destroyed. The only moral choice was to try. Through April and May of 1944, opportunities came and went. Stauffenberg attended briefings. But Hitler was always surrounded by bodyguards. One bomb, even with plastic explosives, might not be enough to kill him inside a reinforced bunker. But Stauffenberg persisted. He knew that to try and fail was still to prove that not all of Germany's sons had surrendered their conscience to Hitler's madness. As D-Day approached in June 1944, the conspirators grew desperate. Once the Allies established themselves in France, the war would enter its final phase. Germany's defeat would become absolute. Time was running out. July 20th, 1944 began like any other day at the Wolf's Lair. The summer heat pressed down on the compound. Hitler was scheduled to hold a military conference to review the situation on the Eastern Front. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel had been wounded and replaced by Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge. Stauffenberg arrived that morning carrying 2 bombs in his briefcase. Security checks were relatively light. His status as a decorated officer and his obvious disability made guards less suspicious. He was allowed to enter. At 12:30, Stauffenberg was called into the conference room. Hitler sat at the head of the table, bent over maps showing the deteriorating situation in France. Stauffenberg placed his briefcase under the table as close to Hitler as he dared, perhaps 2 meters away, then excused himself to make a phone call. At 12:42, the bomb detonated. The explosion was catastrophic. The conference room erupted. Windows shattered. The wooden table splintered, and 4 officers were killed instantly. Outside, Stauffenberg saw smoke rising and believed Hitler was dead. He ran to his car, drove to the airfield, and took off for Berlin. Operation Valkyrie had to be activated immediately. For one brief, shining moment, the conspirators believed they had succeeded. Orders went out to mobilize the reserve army. Troops moved toward Berlin. SS units were detained. Gestapo officers were arrested in the conspirators' command center. Men who had lived in fear for months finally allowed themselves to hope. But at 4:30 that afternoon, devastating news arrived. Hitler had survived. The table's thick oak leg and an officer who had moved the briefcase had shielded him from the blast. Stauffenberg and his co-conspirators had mere minutes to realize their gamble had failed. Within hours, the conspiracy unraveled. General Fromm, fearing for his life, turned on them. That night, in the courtyard of the Bendler block, Stauffenberg and 3 others were executed by firing squad. His last words, shouted as the bullets tore into him, were, "Long live sacred Germany." The Gestapo unleashed a wave of terror. Over 200 people were arrested. More than 50 were executed. Families were punished under the Sippenhaft law, kin liability. Nina von Stauffenberg, Klaus's wife, was arrested while pregnant with their 5th child and sent to a concentration camp. Their children were taken away under false names, but miraculously survived. Hitler's wrath was unmatched. He demanded vengeance, not through courts, but through spectacle. At the People's Court, Judge Roland Freisler screamed at the accused. Defendants were humiliated, stripped of dignity, and hanged with piano wire. Hitler had the executions filmed. He watched them repeatedly, calling the conspirators cowards, even as he knew their courage had shaken his regime to its core. The regime's vengeance was total. Ludwig Beck, offered the choice of suicide or trial, shot himself rather than face torture. Tresckow, learning he was about to be arrested, walked to the front lines and deliberately moved into the line of fire. Goerdeler was captured and hanged. Admiral Canaris was executed in a concentration camp days before the war's end. Inside the Wolf's Lair after the blast, Hitler's uniform was torn, his eardrums ruptured, his arm injured, but he lived. When he awoke, he whispered, "Now I am completely immortal." Goebbels seized the moment. Radio broadcasts proclaimed the Führer's survival as a miracle. Hitler himself spoke that evening. His trembling voice carried across Germany, declaring that Providence had spared him. Millions listened, some in renewed devotion, others in silent despair. In Berlin, confusion reigned. General Fromm, desperate to save himself, declared the coup illegal and arrested the plotters. He convened a hasty court-martial, and by midnight, Stauffenberg was dead. Within days, Fromm himself was executed. Hitler trusted no one. The Gestapo's investigation revealed the true scale of the conspiracy. It reached far beyond Stauffenberg, across the army, foreign office, intelligence networks, and even the church. Men like theologian Dietrich Bonhoeffer and members of the Kreisau Circle had dreamed of a moral Germany beyond Nazism. Bonhoeffer, already imprisoned, was executed weeks before the war's end. His final words were, "This is the end, for me, the beginning of life." Fear blanketed Germany. Thousands were interrogated. Many disappeared. And yet, in whispers and in secret letters, the story of Stauffenberg began to spread. For the first time, the myth of Hitler's invincibility had been shattered by Germans themselves. When the war ended 9 months later, Germany lay in ruins. Cities were obliterated. Millions were dead. The country divided. For years, the July 20th conspirators were not universally honored. Some called them traitors. But as Germany rebuilt, as it searched for a moral identity, their story grew. Historians, philosophers, and soldiers came to understand what Stauffenberg had represented. the conscience of a nation that had lost its soul. Today, the Bendler Block stands as a memorial. Each July 20th, German leaders and soldiers gather there to honor the men who resisted tyranny from within. Cadets in the modern German army no longer swear loyalty to a Führer, but to the Constitution, a transformation rooted in Stauffenberg's sacrifice. His name lives on, in schools, in memorials, in postage stamps. He became not a failed assassin, but a symbol of moral courage. The bomb he planted did not destroy Hitler's regime, but it destroyed the illusion that all Germans followed blindly. When the shots rang out that night in July, their echo carried through generations. They proved that even in tyranny's heart, conscience could still ignite a flame. The bomb that failed to kill Hitler restored a fragment of humanity to a nation drowning in madness. Claus von Stauffenberg died believing his attempt had failed. He never knew that his name would live forever as the man who dared to act when others obeyed, and as proof that even in the darkest night of history, the light of conscience cannot be extinguished. And that's where this extraordinary story comes to an end, not with glory or spectacle, but with reflection. Every name, every moment, and every decision in history shapes the world we live in today. What we uncover, what we choose to remember, defines how the future sees the past. If you found this story powerful, there are many more waiting to be told. Stories of courage, strategy, sacrifice, and the forgotten moments that changed the course of World War II. Don't let them fade into silence. Subscribe now so you never miss another deep dive into the untold truths of our history. And before you go, stay with us. On your screen right now are 2 more documentaries we've carefully crafted for you. Click one and continue your journey through the hidden pages of World War II.